So first, thank you so much to Inclusive Asia for inviting me. It's really a great privilege and honor to be spending time with the disability movements and advocates from Chinese-speaking Asian countries. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. So I've titled this presentation now for the PowerPoint, From Patient to Citizen, CRPD Articles 12 and 14, because I think that captures the shift in attitudes, in thinking that the CRPD promotes. Instead of being treated as patients, people with psychosocial disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities are full citizens of our societies. And I've also included Article 14 as well as Article 12 because it's inextricably linked. Because in the lives of many people with psychosocial disabilities, the biggest threat to autonomy in our daily lives is involuntary commitment in psychiatry. So in my view, we need to think about these two articles together and not separate them. Otherwise, we're really going to leave out an important part of the right to autonomy for people with psychosocial disabilities. So I have a lot of slides. I don't know how many I'll get through, but we'll do the best we can. To give people an orientation, in case not everyone is very familiar with Articles 12 and 14, these articles guarantee core civil rights that are commonly deprived to people with psychosocial, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities. I include as people with cognitive disabilities people who have dementia, people, sometimes autistic people will prefer to be known as people with cognitive disabilities. So all these groups are people who are commonly deprived of the right to legal capacity and the right to liberty. And where this deprivation of rights is discriminatory because other people in our societies are not facing these kinds of deprivations just because of who they are. Let's talk about legal capacity, which is guaranteed by Article 12. So first, it guarantees recognition that all people with disabilities are recognized as persons before the law. The law cannot treat any human being as if they're not a person, as if they're, for instance, in the shameful history of my country, our laws treated some people as property and allowed them to be enslaved and treated them as the property of someone else. So every human being has to be recognized as a person in the law. Also, legal capacity means that we have the capacity as a matter of law to hold rights and to conduct legal acts. So we have the capacity to hold rights, to be recognized in the law as having the right to manage, I don't know, what's a good example of rights? The right to vote, for instance, or the right to get married to someone who also wants to marry you, and the right to conduct legal acts, to actually go ahead and make a contract with somebody or to make your own decision as a matter of free and informed consent about whether to have a particular medical treatment. It's important that under the CRPD, some of the words used to define legal capacity in different languages might mean one term or the other, or might mean both. But the intention in the negotiations, I think what's clear from looking at the text of Article 12 as a whole, and what's been made clear in the interpretation of Article 12 by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which monitors the treaty, is that legal capacity is a human right, it's a universal right, and everyone, at least all adults, are guaranteed both types of legal capacity, to hold rights and to conduct legal acts. So legal capacity as a human right in the CRPD also includes the right to be provided with support and accommodations if the person needs them in exercising legal capacity. So we all know at any time in our life we might actually need somebody to help us. We might need to ask somebody's advice. We might not be able to understand the legal document that's put in front of us. We might not be sure what kind of decision we want to make, or we might need help communicating. And for many people with disabilities, we need that help more than other people. So in the CRPD, that's a right, that if you need support to understand information, to figure out what decision you want to make, or to communicate your decision, you have a right to be provided with that support. And also with accommodations, people need to be able to listen extra carefully to you to figure out what's your best way of communicating. We have the right to have our will and preferences respected in the exercise of legal capacity. So there need to be safeguards to make sure that people are respecting the will and the preferences of people with disabilities. And this right to legal capacity extends to all aspects of life, including financial transactions, legal proceedings, so the right to be a witness in court or the right to make a complaint in court if someone has done a wrong to you, the right healthcare decisions, marriage and family, etc. So next, to go to liberty and security of the person, which is dealt with in Article 14, that includes the right to not be detained or deprived of your liberty based on a disability. So we know that the state may deprive people of their liberty if they want to arrest you for committing a crime, if they accuse you of a crime and arrest you for that, or if the state convicts you of committing a crime and they impose a prison sentence. The UN Human Rights Framework does not challenge that. For the UN Human Rights Framework, it's legitimate if the state deprives someone of liberty for committing a crime. We haven't gotten to a point of really challenging that, although there's a lot of preferences for not even using deprivation of liberty in that context. But people with psychosocial disabilities, and sometimes people with intellectual disabilities as well, are commonly deprived of our liberty under involuntary commitment regimes to psychiatric facilities. And that is a complete violation of the CRPD. It's a discriminatory regime of detention. It's often very intimately linked with deprivation of legal capacity. When you're deprived of your liberty, all of your autonomy is taken away, and it's a discriminatory deprivation of liberty based on your disability, based on the fact that someone has identified you as having a psychosocial disability or an intellectual disability. Sometimes they will also include in the determination that the person is a danger to themselves or others. But consider, people without disabilities can take risks, can place themselves at risk. They can even place other people at risk. But so long as they're not violating the criminal law, there's no danger to self or others standard that's applied to people without disabilities, only to people with disabilities. So it's a discriminatory detention, and the whole system has to be abolished according to the CRPD. Also, people with disabilities have a right to be treated equally as others in criminal proceedings that may result in depriving the person of liberty, a right to humane conditions of detention that respect the CRPD if you are, say, arrested for a crime, and the right to not be subjected to violence by the state and to have the state's protection against acts of violence by others. So security of the person is also a way that we can say, when we're locked up in psychiatric institutions, we have no control over what is done to us. Often people can be tied to a bed, put in other kinds of restraints, locked up in a small room in solitary confinement, and forced to take drugs that really make us feel terrible mentally and physically. And we consider that to be acts of violence by the state. And the right to security of the person on an equal basis with others guarantees to us under the CRPD that that should not happen. Now, sorry, where do I go? Okay. So where did this come from? It was people with psychosocial disabilities, also sometimes referred to as users and survivors of psychiatry, and people with intellectual disabilities who were fighting for our freedom in a global, worldwide movement that brought these provisions into the convention. The CRPD drafting process welcomed our ideas because the states who were negotiating that convention knew that they didn't have the expertise about people with disabilities. Only people with disabilities have the expertise, have the knowledge about our own lives and what we need. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities clarified some debates on what were the standards that had to be applied and what states had to do in general comment number 1 on Article 12 and the guidelines on Article 14. And my perspective in particular is grounded in my experience in being a survivor of forced psychiatric interventions, a member of the user survivor movement and movement of people with psychosocial disabilities since 1978, as a lawyer and as a participant in drafting the CRPD. Okay, so I'll just try to. CRPD paradigm is sometimes called inclusive equality. People with disabilities have the same rights and duties as other people. We all have responsibilities as well as rights as members of society, and I think it's important to the dignity of people with disabilities that this is acknowledged. Inclusivity, the law should take into account the lived experience of people with disabilities in the same way as it takes account the lived experience of other people. And self-representation, people with disabilities speak for ourselves. We know the best. From our collective knowledge and our collective movements, we develop the principles, the policy ideas that actually states need in order to move us forward. What's the difference between the old and the new paradigms of how to approach the rights of people with disabilities, especially people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities? As I said, I'm coming from my perspective as a person with psychosocial disability, a person who survived forced psychiatric interventions. So the pre-CRPD paradigm before the convention is that this is a medical condition. And of course, many people still think that way, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone who would identify themselves as having a mental illness and this being a medical condition. But there's a new way of thinking about it that's actually more open to seeing ourselves as full citizens, full participants in society, that instead of thinking of it as an illness, which means doctors are really in charge of knowing what's wrong with us and figuring out what we need to do in our lives, we can see ourselves as people with disabilities. Disability is, in the social model, is an interaction between the person and society. We can use words like crisis, distress, difficulty, or diversity to talk about our experiences in ways that don't necessarily appeal to the idea of illness, the idea that there's something wrong with us and that it's doctors who are best able to say what that is and say what we need to do. So again, the old paradigm says we need to be under the care of medical experts. The new paradigm says a person might choose to use medical support like psychiatric medication as a tool, but we might also choose to not use those medical supports. We might choose to figure out our own way. Maybe I just know that I need to stay by myself or go off into the woods for a few days, and then I'm going to come back. I just need people to let me alone to do that. Or maybe I need personal support. I need to call up my friend or someone who I know will support me, or a therapist, and get support from those people. And I may say, no, the medication is not something that actually helps me feel better. So it's a tool instead of the idea that we need to be under the care of medical experts. And the old paradigm treats us as wards, like wards of a guardian, patients, recipients of care, and the new paradigm treats us as citizens and active participants in life. So pre-CRPD legal capacity can be easily denied or restricted. In CRPD, legal capacity is a human right, cannot be restricted based on disability. And it includes capacity to have rights and capacity to conduct legal acts. In the old paradigm, liberty can be deprived in mental health settings. In the new paradigm, states must abolish all these laws and practices of detention of people with psychosocial disabilities. The old paradigm, acts that really are considered as torture in international law when performed against non-disabled people, are allowed as treatment of us. Consider that the administration of neuroleptic drugs against a person's will was recognized as a form of physical torture by a UN Special Rapporteur on Torture in the year 1986. And nobody paid attention to what that meant in terms of people with psychosocial disabilities routinely being subjected to this extreme violation of our bodies in psychiatric institutions. It was only really being treated as torture if you were a non-disabled person, if you were having this done to you for reasons that psychiatrists thought were not legitimate, you know? So it's important. The CRPD Article 15 guarantees to people with disabilities equal protection against torture. And I think we need to keep making this argument that it's simply intolerable and unacceptable to say that if you have been diagnosed by psychiatry, it's okay to force drugs into the person's body that are going to make you feel that you can't, that you're being in a straitjacket, or that you have an intolerable sensation of needing to move, or that you can't think for yourself. And that's what these drugs do. So under the CRPD, there's an absolute prohibition of forced psychiatric interventions and psychiatric treatment if the person wants the medical treatment, or if they want some other kind of psychosocial support, can be done only with the person's prior free and informed consent. So let's talk about support practices for people with disabilities. Under the pre-CRPD, the old paradigm, even support practices were done from a point of view of professionals know best. We would look to psychiatrists, psychologists, other kinds of professional workers to see, you know, who are the experts in what people with psychosocial disabilities need? Who are the experts in what people with intellectual disabilities need? In the CRPD, we're really talking about support for the person to clarify her own perceptions and choices. So the person is really the one who knows themselves best, and support might be very different depending on each individual. So support is always going to be about supporting the person to say what they need, because I don't know. I'm in a separate body from you, and you're in a separate body from me, and it's only in the interaction that we can really understand each other's experiences. Pre-CRPD support for people with psychosocial disabilities in particular was focused on stopping unusual behavior or thoughts that are labeled as psychiatric symptoms. So if a person hears voices, or if a person always feels very anxious and maybe feels like they need to be walking around the room, psychiatry would treat that as a symptom, and everything would be focused on how do we stop you from having these symptoms. Under the CRPD, we follow the person's lead in defining her own support needs, and we don't focus so much on, there's no need to get focused on unusual behavior or thoughts. That's just a part of the person, and we focus on the whole person and what the person actually is going to see as helping them get where they want to be. Under the old paradigm, people with psychosocial disabilities are discouraged from having any ambition. I know in my country, the United States, there's a saying, food, filth, and flowers for the jobs that people with psychosocial disabilities are encouraged to go into, that you're encouraged to go into food service or cleaning or doing something like selling flowers. And those might be fine jobs for a person, but they're also limited. People with psychosocial disabilities are not necessarily encouraged to go to university or to think of themselves as an artist or a musician or somebody who can really just, or a lawyer or someone who can do whatever they might want, or starting their own business. So under the CRPD, we fight to remove barriers to personal advancement. And really, to the extent that these issues are connected with poverty in general, a lot of these, we have to also broaden out and relate ourselves to anti-poverty movements, to movements that are fighting for better conditions for everyone to be able to have the kinds of life they actually want. Under the old paradigm, life is managed by family and service providers. Under the new paradigm, self-determination is respected. Under the old paradigm, people with disabilities are infantilized, treated as children, and treated as irresponsible. Under the CRPD, we accept that we have to be accountable if we're harming somebody else, or if someone else thinks I'm harming them, there has to be some discussion about it. It has to be fair and just. And if I did do a harm, then I have to admit it and say that I'm sorry. But on the other hand, it can't be that people are just accusing me all the time and scapegoating me just because they know I have a disability. So we accept accountability. Where are we in time? I just want to have some sense if I'm... Anyway, I think I just have I'll just keep going. If somebody thinks that I need to cut short, I will. So Articles 12 and 14 in context. Legal capacity and liberty are linked in the lives of people with psychosocial disabilities and sometimes for people with intellectual disabilities also. Both legal incapacitation and detention in mental health facilities are considered regimes of substitute decision-making according to the CRPD committee, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These different regimes are sometimes used interchangeably to restrict freedom. So a family might see, is it easy to get guardianship over the person and use the guardianship to make sure that my child or my sister or brother is going to do the things that I think are best for them. Or if that's not so easy, they might think, okay, well, this person is having a crisis now, or I just can't take care of them well, I'm going to put them in a psychiatric institution. So we really need to look at these two regimes as closely linked. Also, the institution may end up being named as the guardian. If you're a guardian, you can place the person in an institution and they have no power to fight that. So these are very closely linked. And Articles 12 and 14, legal capacity and liberty, are also linked to all other rights that guarantee full inclusion in the community. So the right to an adequate standard of living, Article 28 of the CRPD, what keeps people with psychosocial disabilities in poverty, as so many of us are? We need to take a look at what exactly are these barriers to participation in society. What are these structural forces? And remove the barriers, because that's what the CRPD obligates, not only to remove to make superficial equality of the laws, but to go deeper into laws and policies. And if something appears on the surface to be fair to everyone, but you see that it has a particularly negative impact on people with disabilities, those laws and policies also have to be changed. Non-discrimination in employment, again, identification and removal of barriers, and reasonable accommodation, which may look different for people with psychosocial disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, than people with some other kinds of disabilities where it may be more obvious. The right to health care, access to justice, prevention of violence and abuse. I know for many people with psychosocial disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities, what we say about ourselves simply isn't taken seriously. So we might go to a doctor and say, I have a pain, and the doctor says, oh, that's your bipolar acting up again, that's your schizophrenia acting up again. You just need more medication, and all your pain will go away. And people have died and continue to die because of medical neglect, because the people's own complaints about their health are not taken seriously. And access to justice, similarly, and prevention of violence and abuse, these rights are often denied to people with psychosocial disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities because they're not taking our complaints seriously. And actors in any of these situations, doctors and courts and investigators, need to accommodate unusual communication to find out the truth. And that's an obligation under the CRPD. You can find that in general comment number 1 also. What is required for law and policy reform? Repeal substitute decision-making regimes, including coercive psychiatric admissions and treatment and guardianship and any other similar legal regimes that allow others or courts to take away the person's rights and freedoms. Repeal discriminatory detention. So sometimes even beyond ordinary forced psychiatric admissions based on danger to self or others may be treated separately, and security measures apply to people who are declared to be incapable of being held criminally responsible. That really overlaps with the coercive psychiatric admissions and treatment, but all these forms of discriminatory detention have to be abolished under the CRPD also. States have to enact comprehensive non-discrimination law inclusive of people with psychosocial disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, and people with cognitive disabilities. And they have to go through their laws and identify and repeal discriminatory provisions anywhere in the law. So you need a good team of lawyers in every country, in every jurisdiction, to go through the law. And they should be lawyers with disabilities and lawyers who are non-disabled working together with activists who are people with disabilities to make sure that we catch everything that may not be apparent if you don't have the expertise. States have to develop non-coercive support practices to meet a wide range of diverse needs. Support practices in relation to exercising legal capacity, and support practices in relation to living in the community as well. So states must address the barriers that face people with psychosocial disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and cognitive disabilities. Some of those barriers are going to be similar for all the groups. So for instance, maybe all the groups might be subjected to being put under guardianship. And so we need to develop something. We need to look at why is society using guardianship as a tool? What needs is it fulfilling for society? And how can we separate the legitimate needs from non-legitimate discriminatory aims or motivations, and put into practice something that supports the legitimate aims while respecting the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities. So that is actually how we came to this notion of supported decision-making, that people who want to put someone under guardianship, often they're not coming from, they're coming from a good point of view. They want to offer protection and support to the person. But at the same time, the means they have for doing that, guardianship, it doesn't only allow you to offer support, it takes away the person's own freedom and power as a human being. And so we want to offer the support without taking away the person's freedom and power. And that's how we get to supported decision-making. Some other barriers are dissimilar, are not similar. So for instance, sometimes psychiatric detention regimes are only directed to people with psychosocial disabilities, and we have to address those, even though they may not be, the same. And people with intellectual disabilities may face some other kinds of barriers that the people with psychosocial disabilities don't. So we have to address all the barriers. We have to be aware support in exercising legal capacity takes many forms. For people with psychosocial disabilities in particular, it overlaps with alternatives to medicalization, meaning alternatives to this medicalized approach to psychosocial disability that says the doctor knows best. It overlaps with supports to live in the community and prevent isolation, which is required under Article 19. We have to address support and accommodations in criminal proceedings and detention, which I haven't talked a lot about, but that's also an issue that belongs here. And we have to include outreach to offer support, because people may not be aware that support in decision-making, support for the exercise of legal capacity is available to them. So there needs to be some mechanism to offer support and always respect the person's choice to accept or refuse. That's the bottom line. That's what distinguishes supported decision-making from substitute decision-making, is you always respect the person's choice. I think this is my last slide. So what is required, what is required for law and policy reform? States need to reform the civil code or equivalent in the country to ensure respect for the capacity of people with disabilities to conduct legal acts. There was recently a civil code reform enacted in the country of Peru that is considered by me and many others to be the best in the world in terms of actually complying with the CRPD. There's a couple of others in progress that may also do that, and it's important to know that at least one country now has succeeded in changing its civil code in that way. Remove restrictions to legal acts based on the concept of discernment, the idea of whether a person can understand the act. Instead of restricting the person's right, provide the support, because none of us has a superhuman understanding, a complete understanding of everything, and we need to ensure that people with disabilities have the support and accommodation to make the best decisions they have to equalize the situation between people with disabilities and non-disabled persons, or not even saying it that way, just making sure that people, even non-disabled people, might end up taking advantage of some of these supports in the exercise of legal capacity. There needs to be a possibility for designation and registration of formal arrangements according to the choice of the person concerned. There needs to be, in some very extreme cases, the extreme case of when a person is in coma was always what we talked about. What happens if a person is in a coma? How can that person be exercising legal capacity if there's no communication at all? So the CRPD committee came up with the standard best interpretation of will and preferences. When you're dealing with an adult and their will cannot be obtained despite significant effort, it's the duty of supporters or those interacting with them in some way to make their best interpretation of what the person's will and preferences are likely to be, instead of simply deciding what do I think is in the person's best interest. There has to be an option to designate future supports and advanced planning, and it has to specify accessibility measures and duty to accommodate in places where people are exercising legal capacity, like notaries' offices, courts, banks, doctors' offices, etc. There needs to be some development of restorative justice and conflict resolution measures that are inclusively designed for people with psychosocial, cognitive, and intellectual disabilities and do not medicalize the disability. So I don't know if people are familiar with the concept of restorative justice. It's an alternative to the usual criminal justice system that focuses on allowing the person to, in a sense, atone for their wrongdoing, to make reparations, to give back for what they have taken from others by the harm they did, and to give back to the community and repair their relations with the community instead of focusing on punishment, an act done to the person. That is being promoted by the CRPD committee, because really what happens is when we talk about equality, equal responsibility, equal accountability for the wrongs that we do, then we start saying, well, wait a minute, the criminal justice system is horrible. It's terribly unfair, terribly unjust in all kinds of ways. We know that we don't want people with psychosocial disabilities being treated as irresponsible and being put, instead of into prisons, into psychiatric institutions, which are equally as bad, sometimes worse, sometimes better, depending on the context. But we also don't really want to encourage, let's just put everybody in prison. So the CRPD committee and others, including myself, have been promoting that states should really look into and develop restorative justice that has more of an approach that makes sense, that we would actually positively want to promote as an alternative to prisons for people with disabilities and people without disabilities. Also, I talk about conflict resolution measures, because a lot of times what's happening when people are getting locked up in psychiatry especially, and maybe sometimes also with guardianship, is that there's a conflict between the person and their family. The person might want to do something and it's somehow in conflict with what the family wants, or other people think it's disruptive. So there need to be some kind of, let's look into how we can resolve conflict in a way that doesn't discriminate and that does not treat the person as having a medical, that does not treat the person as essentially a medical case, where all you need is, okay, let's call the psychiatrist. No, you deal with the person, and if the person wants support from their psychiatrist, they can call in their psychiatrist. Or if you're supporting them, you can ask if that's what they want. If the person doesn't have a psychiatrist and hates psychiatry, you don't say to the person, do you want to call a psychiatrist? So, nobody should ever say to me, Tina, do you want to call a psychiatrist? Because everybody knows how I feel about that personally. But someone who is my friend, who I know sees a psychiatrist and has a good relationship with her psychiatrist, if she's having a crisis, I might say, that might be a suggestion I could make, but it's a suggestion. It's not that you're going to, that's the way I'm going to resolve my conflict with the person. No, she's a person and I have to resolve the conflict with her. Lastly, states should develop transitional measures to provide for social and economic assistance to allow individuals to establish themselves in the community after being institutionalized or after a history of forced psychiatric interventions or guardianship. Because when people are subjected to these human rights violations, when you're in an institution for a long time, you lose a lot of your skills of living in the community. When you're subjected repeatedly to forced psychiatric interventions, you don't have a work history. How are you going to apply for a job when you have a month employment here and 2 months employment there, and or under guardianship, if it's always been other people making your decisions about your life and never you about yourself, you need assistance. And I would argue that the state is obligated, especially because the state has actually put us in these situations. The state has put people in institutions, subjected us to forced psychiatric interventions, allowed this system of guardianship to happen. It may or may not be, realistic to say to the state, okay, you have to give us these things now, but they also have positive obligations as such under the CRPD that they have to take steps to the maximum extent of their available resources to ensure that people with disabilities have an adequate standard of living and economic and social rights generally on an equal basis with others. So to the extent that people with disabilities are even more impoverished and disadvantaged in these ways than other people, the states have a positive duty to put resources in to actually equalize the situation. Now, this is the end of the presentation. I've included, this is all going to be available to you. I've included resources that you can click on the links when you get the electronic version. And I've included the concluding observations of the CRPD Committee on China, which includes a part for Hong Kong and a part for Macau. And in the one that you'll get electronically, I also included the concluding observations of the independent experts' review of Taiwan. So we've got all of that and my own resources for you. Thank you very much.